This is Juan Manuel Fangio's title-winning car. One of them, at least. The Scarlet Red Maserati 250F brought him his fifth and final title in the sport. To me, this era of Formula 1 is the most idyllic. The cars looked like elegant wine barrels on wheels. They were painted in vivid colors representing the team's nation, and only big white numbers on the side of the cars would break the even look of the paint. Today, we'll be taking a look at the 1957 season of Formula 1 to see what it must have been like to race in the first decade of the Formula 1 championship. As you can imagine, with these cars sometimes being used for multiple years in a row, this picture we're painting today can somewhat be transposed to the larger second half of the 1950s. These cars came about after Formula 1's first ever regulation change in 1954. These regulations mandated 2.5 liters non-supercharged engines, relegating superchargers to pre-war history. These rules would be enforced from 1954 all the way until 1960. The regulations, although simple, veered away from a more Wild West approach of the early 1950s, when cars were essentially refurbished versions of what was raced before the war. Or at least that was the case for the cars that remained, and there weren't many. Concerns on the lack of Formula 1 vehicles available at the time even meant Formula 1 ran on Formula 2 regulations for 2 years. That's how scarce resources still were in Europe at the time. Yet in 1954, that first regulation change laid the groundwork to make Formula 1 something truly special. It's only 8 years in since the Formula 1 championship was founded, yet one man was already dominating the sport. The Argentinian Juan Manuel Fangio is the most successful driver the sport has seen, something that at the time might have seemed ridiculous to point out since Formula 1 only existed for less than a decade. It's not for lack of competition, however. Times were different, don't get me wrong, but the competition was fierce. Drivers back then were polyvalent. Most of them had to race sports car, F2 cars, non-championship events, and they went over to race on the oval at Indy. Moss, Hawthorne, Collins, Brabhams, Ascari, these names and many more still bring a sense of admiration to racing fans all over the world. These guys were as much Formula drivers as they were sports car drivers, or endurance drivers if you prefer the term. And they were great in anything they raced, as Graham Hill would later prove by being the only driver to win the Triple Crown. The tracks they raced on were undoubtedly the prettiest sight we got to see in F1. It only went downhill from there. Of course, if we could change history, I think we would all advance safety standards if it meant we could save some of the drivers that lost their lives in motor racing. But you gotta admit that hay bales make for better roadside decorations than concrete and metal barriers. The calendar in '57 was composed of tracks through cities, sometimes through villages even, and oftentimes through well-known racetracks. Plenty of choice really, yet I decided to pull a little bit of an anachronism. We're gonna be racing the 57th grid on the very 1954 season Bremgarten track in Switzerland to see what it was like to race Formula 1 cars in the 50s. Now, Switzerland actually banned motor racing back in 1955 following the event at that year's Le Mans race. And if you don't know what happened back then, there's actually a great animated short film that is available for free on YouTube and explains the events pretty well. Now, for the purpose of this specific video, all you need to know is that the race at Le Mans was so gruesome that year that the Swiss government decided to ban motor racing on its soil altogether. And so the last time that Formula 1 would race here at Bremgarten would be in 1954. Yet to me personally, this track just screams 1950, so I had to take this grid to it. And it certainly does help that the track is modeled so well. It's actually made by a modder that goes by the name of Fat Afi, and he modeled this track so well. It feels so alive. It's absolutely amazing. Something else that screams, of course, are the engines of these cars, and the car that we're racing personally here is the Maserati 250F in its V6 form, made by Kunos. There's also a V12 version of this car available, but that car was actually developed by Maserati, tested by Fangio, and in the end he never ended up using it in the race, preferring the nimbleness of the V6 version. So that's the version that we're racing today, trying to impersonate Juan Manuel Fangio. The V12 version, although it costs a lot of money to Maserati for the development, it only ever was used once in race, and that was at Monza by another driver than Fangio himself. And Monza is probably the only place where I would actually see the benefit of the V12 myself as well. Braking in this car is definitely very challenging, but it's a true joy to be driving these cars around this track for sure. We're gonna come back to the driving in a little bit, but let's talk about this grid. I tried to model it off the 1957 Monaco Grand Prix, and I actually used a mod that was made by TMW that you can check out on Patreon. He actually remodeled some of these cars based on all the mods and changed the physics a little bit, I believe. You can actually download all of these for absolutely free, and you can tip the creator on Patreon if you feel that his work is worth it. It's not entirely accurate to the 1957 Monaco Grand Prix race, certainly because this is actually a mod of the 1958 Formula 1 championship. So you have the Ferraris that I'm using here, the cars that are supposed to be the Ferraris, are actually Lancia D50s, and the Cooper is also the version with the engine at the back instead of at the front. But apart from that, it's quite accurate, and it definitely brings off the feeling of driving in the 1950s, just like I wanted. Now, while I was doing the research for these cars, I actually noticed that these cars use a lot of positive camber. I'm actually working on a setup guide for sim racers at the same time as I'm making this vintage racing video. So make sure to subscribe to the channel if that is also something that interests you. It will come later this year, and it takes a lot of time to work on, but it's actually made me notice that these cars use so much positive camber while modern race cars use negative camber. And the reason for that is that the steering on these cars is actually extremely heavy, and it was actually quite difficult for drivers to turn the wheels. Another way they counteracted this was by making huge steering wheels to give a lot more leverage to the drivers to turn in the corners, and it would actually also sometimes be seen hanging on the side of the wheel to try and make the car turn, something that we sim racers of course don't really have to deal with. The other thing that we do have to deal with though is the fact that because they use this positive camber, the turn-in is a lot more understeery, and it's difficult to make the front end of the car turn into the corner. The fact that the engine is at the front also accentuates this feeling. So on turn-in, you will have to brake the car a lot and make sure you're going at the right speed. But once you get the car slowed down, and that can be a tricky part because the brakes of these cars are actually quite difficult, as we got dive bomb there by the van wall. I completely missed that, but yeah, he probably missed his braking, or I was braking a little bit too hard, and so surprised him. And that is something that is often quite difficult to deal with for sure in these cars, is when there's something that you hadn't planned ahead of time happening. Definitely using these drum brakes doesn't help the fact that you can really brake for a very long time, even though these cars are quite light. But once you do get the car turned in and slowing down for the corner, it's a real joy to drive these cars. They have very thin tires, but the sidewalls are quite soft, which makes it easy to make the car drift a little bit, and the car will not punish you for it. You can actually get a lot of angles on these cars without the car wanting to spin out, so that's absolutely great. Coming out of the corners, you can also feel that because the tires are so thin, you will often get a little bit of wheel spin, but with the engine at the front, it's actually a very friendly car to deal with wheel spin, and I would definitely recommend it to new drivers. It's not a car that is all that threatening for a vintage race car, so definitely something that everyone could really benefit from once you deal with the lack of braking power, of course. And with just the colorfulness of the grid and the great racetracks we now have in Assetto Corsa to drive these 1950s cars on, it's definitely a must-have. And if you want to experience this, you can definitely go down in the description, download all of these mods, and it's actually quite easy to set that up.
Fangio retired after that 1957 season.
He said in an interview that his big dream was to win one championship. When he did so in 1951, he was ecstatic, no doubt. Then he managed to win a second time and felt quite happy. Then came a third and so on until he won 5 times. And at that point, it didn't feel the same anymore. Undoubtedly, the fact Maserati retired from competition probably also played a big role in his decision. Overall, I appreciate the legend that is Fangio managed to retire after proving he was still the best driver around, and that at the ripe age of 47 years old. The decade would end with many changes. The Constructors' Championship was introduced in 1958, and it would be won by a British team nonetheless. The beautiful Van Wall would take this award that has been issued to the best team in the sport ever since. That year would also be the last one without any front-engine cars on the grid, as from 1958 onwards, the rear-engine philosophy would take over, never to be swapped out again. Finally, this decade where safety was an almost non-issue ended in tragedy. 1958 would see 4 drivers killed during the championship, and the drivers' champion Mike Hawthorne died in unknown circumstances on a British country road while driving his Jaguar off-season. From our 21st century standpoint, it's easy to forget how brave these drivers really were. The cars were beautiful, but they were just as deadly.